The phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the first thing I heard wasn't a word. It was breathing. Fast, shallow, the kind of breathing a man does when the floor has just dropped out from under him and he hasn't admitted it to himself yet. Then the screaming started. Our shipping gateway has completely frozen. Nothing is moving. The whole eastern corridor is dark. Orders, manifests, customs handoffs, all of it gone. What did you do? What did you do? I knew that voice. I'd spent 18 months learning the exact pitch it hit right before it tried to ruin someone. It belonged to Remington Cross, Director of Distribution Operations at Zenith, and 4 hours earlier I had stood outside a conference room and listened to him rehearse my execution. I held the phone a little away from my ear and let him burn through the first wave. When he finally paused to breathe, I answered him the way you answer a man who thinks he's still holding the knife. Who do you think automated the fraud trackers, Remington? Silence, real silence, the kind that has weight to it. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, I said. It has to do with everything. And somewhere in a data center 2 states away, a script I had written and scheduled weeks earlier was finishing its work. It had already compiled 11 months of falsified inventory reconciliations, matched them against shipping records he thought were buried. And at 11:30 that night it had transmitted the entire package, encrypted, time-stamped, notarized through a chain of custody log, to 3 places at once. Zenith's outside auditors, the federal regulators who oversee international cargo, and because Remington's little operation crossed 6 borders, a tidy referral to Interpol. He had spent his last meeting planning to pin a shortage on me. He didn't yet understand that the shortage had never been a mistake. It was his, and it was already on its way to becoming a case number. But to understand how a man like Remington ends up screaming into a phone at midnight, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who I am, and you have to understand the machine I built, the one that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and doesn't take orders from people who think the truth is something you can renegotiate. Welcome to the corporate vault. This is the place where the quiet ones, the people who got overlooked, talked over, and set up to take the fall, finally get their stories told all the way to the end. If these are the kinds of stories that keep you watching, consider subscribing. We're working our way toward our very first milestone of 1,000 people in this vault, and every single one of you gets us closer. Now let me take you back. My name is Weston Carmichael, and at the time all of this happened, I was the senior logistics systems architect at Zenith. If that title sounds important, let me take some of the shine off it. What it really meant was that I was the person who made sure that when you ordered something and a company on the other side promised to deliver it, the promise was actually true. Behind every tracking number, every "your package has shipped" email, every customs form that clears a port at 3 in the morning, there is a tangle of systems that have to talk to each other perfectly. I was the one who made them talk, and when they stopped talking, I was the one they called. I grew up in a small town in the Ohio Valley, the kind of place where the same families had worked the same jobs for 3 generations. My father ran the parts counter at a farm equipment dealership for 31 years. He could find any bolt, any belt, any obscure component for a tractor that hadn't been manufactured since before I was born, and he could do it from memory. People drove 2 counties over just to have him look something up, because he never made them feel stupid for not knowing. That was the thing about my dad. He had this way of treating the man in the dirty coveralls who couldn't afford the repair exactly the same as the big operation that bought in bulk. He used to tell me that the whole world runs on people keeping their word about small things, and that the moment you decide some people's small things don't matter, you've already started becoming someone you won't like. We weren't poor. I want to be clear about that because people hear small town parts counter and they fill in a story about hardship that wasn't mine. We had enough. What we had, more than money, was the habit of paying attention to people who were easy to ignore. My mother taught 3rd grade and could tell you which kid hadn't eaten breakfast just by the way they held their pencil. Between the 2 of them, I learned that the people who get walked over are usually the ones who never make noise. And I learned to watch for them. That's the part of me that built the fraud trackers, not the engineering part, the watching part. I went to a state school, studied systems engineering, and spent a decade getting good at something very specific, building automated systems that catch the things humans miss, discrepancies, patterns, the one number in a column of 10,000 that doesn't belong. I was never the loudest person in any room. I never wanted to be. The work I do best is the kind nobody notices until the day it saves them. Zenith recruited me away from a logistics firm in Columbus with a sentence that I now find almost funny. The hiring VP looked at me across the table and said, "We need someone who can see the whole board." I took the job because I believed her. I thought I was being hired to protect the system. What I didn't know was that I was being hired into the territory of a man who had already figured out how to feed on it. I met Remington Cross during my second week. He came into the systems group like weather. You felt the pressure change before you saw him. He was tall, expensively dressed in a way that was supposed to look effortless and didn't quite, and he had a habit of remembering your name the first time and then never using it again. He ran distribution operations, which sat directly above the warehouse network, the carrier contracts, and the international freight desk. On paper, he and I were supposed to work closely. In practice, he treated me like a utility, useful when running, invisible otherwise. The first thing I noticed about Remington wasn't the arrogance. Arrogance is common. It was the way the numbers behaved around him. Zenith moved an enormous volume of goods, and a certain amount of loss is normal in any operation that size. Pallets get damaged. Counts come up short. A truck gets into an accident and a load is written off. Every logistics company budgets for what we call shrinkage. And as long as it stays inside a predictable band, nobody worries. Zenith's shrinkage was inside the band, comfortably. That was the first thing that bothered me, not that it was high, but that it was too smooth. Real loss is messy. It spikes when there's a storm, drops in slow months, jumps around by region. Remington's numbers didn't jump around. They sat in a clean, gentle line month after month, like someone was sanding the edges off. I mentioned it once early on in a meeting. I said the loss data looked unusually consistent and asked if anyone had a process note on the reconciliation. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Remington smiled, and I'll never forget this. He smiled and said, "Weston's still learning the rhythm of a real operation. We don't chase ghosts here." Everyone laughed, the polite, terrified laugh people use around a man who controls their bonuses. And I learned the rhythm of the operation all right. I learned it better than he ever imagined. Because here's what I did after that meeting. I didn't argue. I didn't file a complaint that would have died in someone's inbox. I went back to my desk and I started building. Not all at once. You don't build something that finds a fraud you can't yet prove by announcing it. You build it the way water finds a crack, quietly, patiently, one small tool at a time, each one boring enough on its own that nobody thinks to ask about it. I called it the reconciliation suite. To anyone who looked, it was a routine set of automated reports that cleaned up data quality issues. That's even what it mostly did. But folded inside it were the first of the fraud trackers, little processes that watch the gaps between three things that, in an honest operation, should always agree. What was ordered, what was shipped, and what arrived. In an honest operation, those three numbers reconcile. In Remington's operation, they almost reconciled. And almost is where the bodies are buried. I just didn't yet have the one moment that would tell me the gap was no accident. That moment came on a freight dock at 6 in the morning. The first time I saw Remington lie, it was in the freight dock at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. I'd gotten called in because a shipment from Taiwan had come up short, 12,000 smartphone components, but only 11,400 made it to final count. 600 units gone. The dock supervisor, a woman named Martinez who'd been running freight for 15 years, was standing over the opened containers with her clipboard, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense," she kept saying. "The seal was intact, the weight matches, but the count's wrong." Remington arrived 10 minutes after I did, moving through the warehouse like he owned the air itself. He took one look at the manifest, one look at Martinez, and his whole demeanor shifted into performance mode. "Martinez, you've been at this long enough to know that overseas counts are suggestions, not guarantees." His voice was smooth, condescending. "Their quality control isn't what ours is. Write it up as supplier error and move on." Martinez didn't move. "Sir, I've been tracking this supplier for 2 years. Their counts are rock solid. Something happened to this shipment between customs and here." I watched Remington's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He stepped closer to Martinez, using his height. "Are you questioning my assessment?" "I'm questioning the numbers, sir. That's my job." "Your job is to process freight, not to play detective. His voice dropped lower. And if you can't handle the basic reality that international shipping involves loss, maybe we need to discuss whether you're still the right fit for this position. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Martinez looked at me, then back at Remington, and I saw the exact moment she calculated the cost of pushing back. She had 3 kids and a mortgage. She nodded once, sharp and bitter, and wrote, "Supplier count error" on the discrepancy form. Remington smiled. "Thank you for your cooperation." But I was watching the sealed container, the weight numbers, the customs stamps, and I was thinking about 600 smartphone components that had simply vanished from a locked box. A sealed container doesn't lose weight. A count doesn't shrink between 2 honest checkpoints. Someone with access to the gap between customs clearance and warehouse receipt had reached in and taken what they wanted, and then leaned on a 15-year veteran until she signed her own better judgment away. That's when I started building the deeper trackers. It took me about 6 weeks to understand the full shape of what he was doing, and the picture that came together was almost elegant. I'll give him that. Remington wasn't stealing product off the back of a truck like some amateur. He was stealing the gap. Zenith's international freight ran through a web of partner carriers and customs brokers, and somewhere in that web Remington had set up relationships, vendors that existed mostly on paper, brokers who were happy to sign whatever invoice arrived as long as their cut arrived too. Here's how it worked. A shipment of high-value goods, electronics mostly, would leave a supplier overseas with a true count. Say 10,000 units. By the time it cleared the last customs handoff and hit Zenith's domestic warehouse system, the recorded count would be 9,600. 400 units, written off as damage in transit, loss, customs seizure, whatever the paperwork said that month. Those units didn't get damaged. They got diverted, sold through gray market channels, and the money flowed back through the paper vendors. And the loss got smoothed into that beautiful, suspicious, sanded-down shrinkage line that I'd flagged in my second week. The Taiwan shipment Martinez fought over wasn't an outlier. It was a Thursday. Across 11 months, across hundreds of shipments, the numbers were staggering. Conservatively, he was pulling several $100,000 a quarter. And because it crossed international borders and laundered through foreign brokers, it wasn't just corporate theft. It was the kind of thing that has a special name in a federal statute and a dedicated unit at an international police agency. My fraud trackers caught all of it, not by accusing anyone. They just watched the 3 numbers and logged every time the gap behaved in a way that pure chance couldn't explain. Real loss is random. Remington's loss clustered around specific carriers, specific brokers, specific routes, and this was the detail that hanged him specific weeks. He was a creature of habit. He moved his product on a schedule. I had it cold. And here is where most stories like mine go wrong, so let me tell you what I understood in that moment. I couldn't run to HR. HR works for the company, and at Zenith the company's revenue ran through Remington's division. I couldn't email the CFO because I didn't yet know who in the building Remington owned. I couldn't post about it, hint about it, or let a single soul see the part of the suite that mattered. The truth was going to need protection, and I didn't yet know how much. I found out in week 7. I was in my office late, cross-referencing carrier manifests when my screen went black. Not a power failure, not a system crash, a deliberate lockout. My badge stopped working 30 seconds later. I was halfway to the exit when Remington appeared in the hallway like he'd been waiting. He wasn't alone. He'd brought Tommy Vance from security, a thick-necked man who looked like he'd rather be hitting someone than standing around in a suit. "Weston, we need to talk." His voice was different, no boardroom polish. This was the voice he used when he thought nobody important was listening. "My access just got cut," I said evenly. "Temporary measure. There's been some concerning activity in your systems, unauthorized queries, data phishing in areas outside your clearance." He stepped closer. "Tommy here ran a security audit, found some interesting irregularities, international freight routing, carrier billing, customs documentation. All traced back to your login." It was beautiful in a way. He was preemptively framing me for the very investigation that was about to expose him. Report me for unauthorized access, get me terminated for cause, make sure any findings I'd accumulated would be dismissed as the work of a disgruntled employee. "You're saying I'm stealing data?" "I'm saying the logs show what they show." He paused. Of course, if this is all some misunderstanding, we can work it out. Internal discipline, maybe a formal reprimand. Nobody needs to hear about this outside the company. The rational exit. Admit to overreach, accept punishment, everybody keeps their career. Except the fraud trackers weren't in my login. I'd been smarter than that from day one. Show me the logs, I said. His eyes narrowed. You're not in a position to make demands. I'm in a position to request evidence of the accusations being made against me. That's basic procedure. Vance shifted beside me, restless like a dog that wanted to be unleashed. Remington stared at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Tommy, give us some space." Vance looked confused but stepped back down the hall. When we were alone, Remington's voice dropped to a whisper. "Let me explain something to you, Weston. I've been running operations in this industry for 12 years. I know every carrier, every customs broker, every port authority from here to Shanghai. I know which routes are clean and which ones have friction, and sometimes that friction costs us. Product gets delayed. Counts come up short. It's the cost of doing business at scale, and it's built into our margins." He was confessing, not directly but close enough. "Now, I don't know what you think you found in those logs, but I can tell you what it actually is. It's the messy reality of international logistics, dressed up by someone who doesn't understand the business, trying to find patterns that aren't there. And sometimes people see patterns even when they don't exist. Sometimes those people become a problem for everyone around them." The hallway was empty except for us. No witnesses, no recording, just a man who'd built his career on other people's silence, explaining how that silence worked. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go home tonight and think about whether you really want to be the kind of employee who causes problems. And tomorrow morning, you're going to come in and delete whatever amateur investigation you've been running. Clean slate. And if I don't? If you don't, Tommy's security audit is going to find a lot more irregularities, unauthorized access, possible data theft, maybe even evidence of system sabotage." He shrugged. "These things have a way of snowballing once they start rolling." I nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good, I knew you were reasonable." I walked to the exit, badged out with the ID they restored on my way down, because of course they restored it. A lockout that stuck would have raised questions Remington wasn't ready to answer yet, and I drove home. That night I didn't delete anything. I encrypted everything, moved it off-site, and I built the thing that would end him. A dead man's switch. I wrote a process, separate, hidden, scheduled, that would take everything the trackers had compiled, package it into a sealed, tamper-evident report, and transmit it automatically to 3 external destinations the moment certain conditions were met. The outside auditors, the federal cargo regulators, and through the international fraud channel, a referral that would land on Interpol's desk. The conditions were simple. The switch would fire on a fixed schedule unless I personally reset it every 2 weeks. And it would fire instantly, no waiting, if anyone ever tried to lock me out of my systems again. Because Remington had made one crucial mistake in that hallway. He'd told me exactly how far he was willing to go to bury the truth. And that meant I finally knew how much protection the truth was going to need. I reset it like clockwork, and I waited hoping I'd never have to use it. He never stopped, they never do. The board meeting was on a Tuesday, 10 months later. I wasn't invited, which was normal. Architects don't sit in front of the board. But I was in the building late that afternoon because a carrier integration had gone sideways, and I was the only one who could fix it, and the conference room Remington was using had a flaw he'd never bothered to learn. The wall it shared with the systems lab was thin, and the air return carried sound like a pipe. I wasn't trying to listen. I was running a diagnostic, and then I heard my own name and my hands went still on the keyboard. "The shortage in the Eastern Corridor is significant," Remington was saying, in the smooth boardroom voice he saved for people he wanted to impress. "And I want to be transparent with the board about where the breakdown happened. The reconciliation systems Carmichael built have been throwing off our numbers for the better part of a year. Frankly, I've lost confidence. The discrepancies trace back to his architecture. I think we're looking at incompetence at best, and I've asked legal to keep negligence on the table." I sat there in the dark lab and felt something I want to describe honestly because it wasn't rage. Rage came later. In that moment it was a strange, cold clarity. He was going to take the very system that had caught him and present it to the board as the cause of the loss he himself had created. He was going to use my fingerprints to hide his. It was almost beautiful in its nerve. He'd spent a year stealing, and his plan to escape the accounting was to frame the one person in the building who'd been quietly documenting every cent. He would have me terminated for negligence. The narrative would be clean. The systems were flawed, the architect was fired, the losses would mysteriously stabilize once. The problem was gone, because of course they would. He'd just stop stealing for a quarter to sell the story, and then he'd start again with a new system and no one watching it. I heard a board member ask how quickly they could move. I heard Remington say he'd like my access revoked by end of week to protect the integrity of the investigation. By end of week. I want you to understand what that meant, technically, because it's the heart of everything. The moment Remington revoked my access, the moment anyone locked Weston Carmichael out of his own systems, the dead man's switch would read that as the exact condition it had been waiting all those months to see. He thought he was cutting off my hands. He was reaching for the trigger himself. I packed up my diagnostic, walked out past the conference room without looking in, and drove home with the radio off. I didn't gloat. I didn't even feel triumphant yet. Mostly I felt tired and a little sad, because part of me had still been hoping he'd give me a reason not to do this. He hadn't, so I went home, I made coffee I didn't drink, and I did the last thing I needed to do. I stopped resetting the switch, and then I changed nothing else, and I waited for someone to lock me out. It didn't even take until end of week. Remington was impatient. That was always going to be his undoing. He wanted me gone before I could make noise, so he had it pull my credentials that very night around 11:15. Quietly, he thought. A routine offboarding, scheduled after hours so there'd be no scene in the morning. The instant my access was revoked, the system noticed. It didn't panic because it wasn't built to panic. It did exactly what it had been told to do months earlier. It woke the dead man's switch. It pulled the sealed report. It verified the chain of custody, confirmed the cryptographic timestamps, and at 11:30 it began transmitting 13 gigabytes of evidence to 3 destinations at once into inboxes that would open at 6 the next morning. And then, because Remington had also frozen my access to the operational gateway in his rush to lock me out, something else happened that he never anticipated. The reconciliation suite was woven into the live shipping systems. It wasn't malware. It wasn't sabotage. But it was load-bearing. It was the thing quietly keeping the Eastern Corridor's data flowing correctly. When it yanked the credentials it was tied to, without understanding what they were touching, the suite did the only safe thing a well-designed system does when its integrity is compromised. It stopped. It froze the gateway rather than let corrupted, unmonitored data move through it. That's the call I got at 11:47, though I'd been awake since 11:30 watching the upload confirmations land. "What did you do?" His voice cracked on the question. "The entire gateway is frozen, everything is down." "Who do you think automated the fraud trackers, Remington?" The silence stretched. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "Weston, hear me out, there's been a mistake." "No mistake. The system worked exactly as designed." "You don't understand what you've done. That report, whatever it is, it's going to hurt innocent people. Good people who work in this company." I almost laughed, like Martinez. "Who?" "The dock supervisor you threatened for doing her job. The one who knew something was wrong with that Taiwan shipment. 600 smartphone components missing from a sealed container. Your first mistake was thinking she'd forget." I heard him breathing, fast, shallow. "How much of it did you track?" "All of it, 11 months. Every diverted shipment, every paper vendor, every customs broker in your little network. Your gray market sales, your offshore accounts." "Jesus Christ, you have to stop this. You have to kill that report." "Can't, it's already gone. Automated transmission at 11:30. Your own security team triggered it when they pulled my access. The federal cargo people have their copy, so do the outside auditors. And the international referral, that one's going to be interesting. There's a whole division that deals with cross-border freight fraud. They're very thorough." I heard a sound like a chair falling over. "Weston," his voice was pleading now. "There's a version of this where everyone walks away. You want money? I can arrange money, a better position somewhere else. I know people." I wanted honest numbers, Remington. That's all I ever wanted. You're destroying people's lives over bookkeeping errors. No, I said, keeping my voice steady. You destroyed people's lives stealing from them. I just documented it. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then even now, even with his whole operation unraveling the threat. You don't know who you're messing with. This goes deeper than you think. There are people involved who don't just fire problems. They solve them. Then they'd better get started, I said. Because by 6 a.m. this stops being a company problem and starts being a federal case. And I hung up. At 6:17 the next morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Zenith's general counsel, asking very politely if I could come in to speak with some people. The forensic auditors had arrived early. The team worked for 3 days straight. I sat in conference room C, explaining code to agents who asked very precise questions about timestamp verification and data custody chains. They were good at their job. They understood that the technical details weren't just evidence. They were the foundation that would make or break a federal case. Walk us through this again, Agent Dana Holloway said, pointing at her printout of the transmission log. The system fired automatically when Mr. Cross revoked your access. That's correct. The switch was designed to trigger if I was locked out, or if I failed to reset it manually every 2 weeks. And you couldn't have altered the data after transmission. No, the package was sealed using cryptographic hashing before it ever left. Any alteration would be immediately detectable. She nodded, and this data was collected over what time period? 11 months, from my second week at the company until the night Mr. Cross had me locked out, before I knew he was planning to frame me. She made a note, then asked me to walk them through the Taiwan shipment. I told them about Martinez, the missing components, the threat on the dock. Her partner, Agent Rodriguez, looked up from his laptop. We'd like to speak with Miss Martinez. Is she still employed here? As far as I know. They found her in the warehouse, still running the freight dock. She told them everything, the missing components, the intimidation, the supplier count error she'd been forced to write up against her professional judgment. She'd kept her own informal records, she said. 15 years had taught her to document the things that didn't make sense, even when her boss told her to forget them. Especially then. I knew something was wrong, she told Agent Holloway. But I've got kids to feed. I couldn't afford to push back. You can afford to push back now, Holloway said. In fact, we need you to. For about half a day, Remington's spin almost worked. Disgruntled employee, fabricated report, sabotage. People wanted it to be true because it's a cleaner story. But here's the thing about a system that doesn't lie. It doesn't get nervous in a meeting, and it doesn't change its account under pressure. The forensic team confirmed within a day that the data was authentic, untampered, and generated continuously over the previous year, long before any firing, long before any motive he could pin on me existed. You can't retroactively fake 11 months of contemporaneous records. The timeline itself was a witness, and it testified that I had been documenting the truth quietly the entire time, expecting nothing. The paper vendors unraveled first, shell companies, fake addresses, accounts that led to other accounts in countries with flexible banking laws. The brokers started talking next, each one trying to minimize their own exposure by maximizing Remington's. They painted a picture of a man who'd built his fraud like a business, professional, systematic, and stupid enough to threaten the one person quietly building a case against him for 11 months. On the 4th day, they arrested him at his house in Westchester. 3 federal charges to start: mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit customs fraud. The international charges would come later. I watched the coverage from my apartment, him walking to the federal courthouse in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled from a night in jail, looking smaller than he had in that hallway. Diminished. He never made another threat to anyone. Martinez called me that evening. I wanted to thank you for listening, for remembering. You did the hard part. You told the truth when it mattered. Turns out it mattered more than I thought. The board chair, a woman I'd met exactly once, called me personally and asked me to come in and help rebuild. I went. Not because I was eager to save Zenith, but because there were a few thousand honest people in that company whose jobs depended on it, surviving the thing one man had done to it. Remington never thought about them once, so I did. I want to tell you the part that matters most, and it isn't the moment he sat down in his chair and went quiet. That part felt good for about an hour, and then it just felt sad, the way watching anyone destroy themselves eventually does. The part that matters is why the system worked. It didn't work because I'm clever, though I'm decent at what I do. It worked because I built the honest version of it back in my second week, when no one was watching me and no one was threatening me, back when I had no enemy and nothing to gain. The trackers that caught a year of theft started as a tool that just wanted 3 numbers to agree, because that's what I was hired to do, and that's who I am. They weren't a weapon I forged to destroy Remington. They were a habit of attention that he happened to walk into. That's the whole secret, if there is one. The people who try to set you up are almost always improvising. They react, they scheme, they adjust the story week to week. But a quiet, honest record built before the trouble starts will outlast every improvisation, because the truth doesn't have to remember its lies. It was already written down. It was already true. Remington spent his last meeting planning how to make me the cause of a shortage he created. He never understood that the shortage had a fingerprint, and the fingerprint was his, and a system I'd built long before I had any reason to suspect him had been quietly preserving it the entire time. He thought firing me would erase the evidence. Firing me was the one action guaranteed to release it. I stayed at Zenith another year, long enough to rebuild the division clean and train the people who'd run it after me. Then I left on my own terms, to do the work I actually love, building systems that protect the people nobody's watching out for. My father came to visit me not long after it all settled, and I tried to explain what had happened, all the technical pieces of it. He listened the whole way through, nodded, and said the only thing he ever really needed to say. "Sounds like you kept your word about the small things." I had, that's all it ever was, remembering Martinez's name, documenting the gap in a manifest, watching for the people who get overlooked, small things that turn out to add up to justice. If this story stayed with you, if you know what it's like to be the quiet one in the room, the one who gets talked over right up until the moment the truth finally speaks for itself, then you belong here in the corporate vault. Subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next story finds you. We're reaching for our first milestone of 1,000 people, and you being one of them means more than you know. Take care of yourself, watch the small things, and I'll see you in the next one.